Hey guys, welcome back to another video. My name is Dinja and today we will be sewing Danny Chu's free coat pattern. Cutting your fabric, you want the following pieces to be cut from your outer fabric only, including the belt and both the lining and the outer fabric. But as you'll see, I didn't even end up using the facing lining, then only the lining. And finally, I had no idea what to do with this piece, which I eventually figured out but didn't end up using. The fabric I'm using today is actually from an old pair of trousers that I used to own. So it's been in the closet for a while, which means a lot of creases. So it's always a nice start just to make this nice and flat, get all those creases out. So let's get started by doing the center back. So I'm just lining my pattern piece up against the center back seam and marking where the gap will be for the stand. So just with a piece of chalk. You just want to carefully sew up until both of those marks, leaving the gap in the middle. Just remember the seam allowance as marks on the pattern because I'm actually doing too much of a seam allowance and I had to unpick it and redo it later, so save yourself a bit of time. So now I'm just going to overlock these two seams separately, and you do want to make sure you're sewing them separately and not together at once because you do want to keep that gap for your stand. And now you just want to give it a good press with the iron just to keep it nice and flat. And there you go, you've got your beautiful gap. Okay, let's continue with the side back. So you just want to grab your pattern, put it on each side, and then the back yoke will sew up the top afterwards. So you just want to pin your side seams together, your center side seams, and sew in place with your regular seam allowance. So these side seams I decided to overlock together and then ironed them towards the center back. So this just makes it a little bit nicer to work with. So now it's time to do the back yoke. So it's just a little piece, you need one off. So you just want to line it up. So to find the center back of the yoke, I just fold it in half and use a pin to mark it. So sorry for going out of frame, but it was actually at this point that I realized that I did a little bit too much of my seam allowance. So I had to go back and unpack these 3 seams just with the correct seam allowance, which actually ended up fitting this yoke better. You'll see me trying to make it work, but trust me, it doesn't, so don't try to stretch it out. And here I am actually realizing and checking my seam allowance. As you can see, a little bit too much. So with the seam allowance changed and it actually fits now, it's time to sew down the yoke. So just take your time, pin it in place. And then once you've sewn this with the actual seam allowance, you just want to overlock this edge. So with the seam now overlocked, you'll want to make sure that it's folded nicely up, and I'm actually using a special foot here and just top stitching it in place, so just to catch that seam upwards. And now I'm also going to go to that gap and just to top stitch those 2 top spots, just to keep the seam nice and flat around it so it doesn't get caught when I'm using the stand. So let's continue by sewing the front, or more specifically the pockets. Start by taking the pocket flap. You need 2 of the outer fabric and 2 of the lining fabric. So you want to line them up with the right sides together and just stitch around the outside. I decided to do a slightly narrower seam compared to the normal 1/4 inch seam allowance, just to make sure I had a bit more room to work with. Also, just make sure to leave the bottom straight edge open so you can turn it around later. This will be hidden into the seam. So next up, you just want to cut the corners to remove the excess bulk. This is just so it's a bit easier to turn and top stitch. To help push out the corners, a sharp object like a pencil or like I'm using scissors can help just to keep the corners nice and sharp. And top stitch around the edge. Now it's time to take the pocket back and the center front pieces. I'm just using a piece of chalk to transfer the markings where the pocket flap will be attached. Once this is all marked, I place the pockets facing inside and pin it on each end. Taking the pocket bag, you want the wider edge on the bottom and mark again with a piece of chalk from the pattern where the pocket should be and pin this in place. It's easier to do the 2 pins on each end. And then I also did one in the middle. And now you just want to sew this in place using your regular seam allowance, just down a straight line here. So also grab your front side, and I've just gone ahead and overlocked around all the edges on these, including the one that we just sewed just down that one edge. So it is a little bit hard to sew those curved edges, so don't feel obliged to do them. I just really like to do it and make my life difficult. You can also just use a zigzag stitch to overlock. So as you can see, I'm now just lining these up just from the pockets, so that if you lined it up properly with your chalk, that should be just perfect. And now I'm just going to pin along these edges, okay? It's a little bit difficult with the curve, just use lots of pins, trust me. And then any tension will relieve later by just snipping into the edge. Alright, so when everything is pinned, you just want to sew around the outside edge. When that's done, it should look something like this. So you just snip those inner corners by the pockets and that little curve, just so it can lay nicely. And your pocket is just over the top there with beautiful excess. So now it's time for the front yoke. So just to make it easier, I first line it up the top before flipping it down so it's right sides together and pinning that in place. Just use your regular seam allowance to sew this, and then afterwards I like to overlock this seam as well. So now that this seam is overlocked, we're going to top stitch it down. So just make sure your seam is up towards the top there, and I'm just top stitching it, just to keep it nice and flat out of the way and looking really beautiful. Alright, let's continue with the lining. So it's basically the same as we just did, just without the pockets. So you just want to line the center front with the side front up and just pin these in place. Just be aware with the curve again, it's a little bit fiddly, use lots of pins and you'll get through it. Just take your time with sewing this as well. I had to unpick it several times just to get the extra puckers out, but no harm in having to do that. Alright, so once I've sewn and overlocked in my case, it is time to make those curves lay smoothly. So I just take the scissors and just cut some into the edge there. Sorry for going out of frame, I was just having a good look if I wasn't getting any extra puckers by accident. I have several spots that I like it so it can lay smoothly. And then I'm just finger pressing the seam with the seam facing towards the back. So I'm just grabbing the pattern here for reference to see how much of a hem I need to do. So all you want to do is just a little double hem. So I'm just overlocking the bottom first, nice clean edge, and then under the sewing machine I'm gonna do like a rolled hem. So just fold it over twice, make sure it's nice and even with the two sides, and just pinning that in place. And now I'm just grabbing the other pattern piece just for reference again to make sure that it's lining up properly with what I've done before stitching that down. Okay, and sorry for the sudden jump here, but I have gone ahead and attached the front to the lining front. And I'm just pinned that in place and sewing that. You'll see in the next clip a little bit better of what it looks like. But yeah, just same thing, it does have a slight curve, so just pinning that, taking your time sewing it, and then you're gonna end up clipping that curve to relieve the tension in there as well. So this is really important to clip that curve, otherwise it is gonna end up bulking and not look very nice in general. And now I'm just gonna finger press this seam towards the lining side, and I did end up taking an iron to this later on, but just to make sure everything is laying nice and smooth, and I'm doing this towards the lining so it's facing towards the side or towards the back. So it's just quite nice to do that. Alright, and now it's time for the collar. So you've got both of these pieces, but I'm grabbing the one that you need one outer from and one lining from. So I'm just double checking what the right side is. You just want to line them up, and then what all that's going to be doing is putting them from one end to the other end. And yes, you will have a gap in the center, and that is correct. So as you can see, I'm just starting to pin it here. Just having both together, I'm not bothering with doing a stage stitch or anything. So it's just pinning that into the curve on both sides. Just remember where your back is where the lining side is, okay? So just keep pinning and putting that in place. So with sewing this, just take your time, go nice and slow. I've used quite a few pins because I am going around two curves. And as you can see, I also pinned one in the middle just to keep them lined up. So just take it nice and easy. So once you've finished, all you want to do now is overlock around the bottom edge that you just sewed, around the top and the two sides. As you can see, I've done right here. So let's put that to the side and continue on with the back. And actually, we're going to be doing the belt loops. So as you can see, I've overlocked the top edge, and now all I'm gonna do is fold this into threes. So I'm gonna fold the raw edge up first, and then I'm gonna fold the overlocked edge down on top. So this is just gonna make sure that if it's not stitched down properly in the back, then at least it will be finished nicely. So I'm just top stitching around the two edges to make it nice and flat and even. And at this point, it is all good if it's not caught fully in the back. So I'll show you in a second. I'll turn it around, and it is actually not fully caught on. Here you can see it's still open on one side there, but because the other side is top stitch, it is all good, so don't worry about it. So cutting this to size, I ended up drawing on the pattern exactly where I needed to go. And I'm just using a piece of chalk to mark where I need to sew. This is just so I can make sure it is lined up properly, and then I can cut it from there. So it's time to place the first belt loop. So this is gonna go on the center back. So just using my pattern here as a guide on where I needs to go. So it is just above the gap that we left for the stand, and I just left the pattern beside it a couple of times just to make sure. And I really struggled pinning this in place, but just be really careful. I did accidentally pin myself in the thumb. But yeah, just be really careful. I did end up finding out that just putting one in the center is a lot easier. And then I just folded the pieces around as needed when I sewed it. So I really don't recommend doing this struggle that I'm doing right now. So yeah, just sewing that in place. I'm using that top stitch thing, like the same width that I've been doing for every top stitching. And you can see it's got like a little bump in the center, so it's nice and easy to put the belt through later on. So for the other two belt loops, I'm just repeating the same process. I'm grabbing a pattern piece, lining it up with all the seams that I'd already done, and I'm just putting actually a different method here, pinning this first on the sides just so I know where it needs to go. And now I'm just gonna grab the belt loop where I want it to be. I'm pinning this in place just like we did previously, and I'm actually still trying to figure out the best method to do this at this point. So I'm just folding the ends in and still struggling with the whole pinning thing. And here I'm kind of realizing a slightly different way of pinning it, but yeah, probably easier just to pin it in the center first and just fold it in when you're actually sewing it. So with that side done, I decided to just fold the bottom in and sew it in place without the whole pinning. And now your belt loops are all done. So with all the notions finally out of the way, it is time to connect these two pieces together, or three. So you just want to attach them by the shoulder seams. That's all what we're gonna do in this step. Just lining up the shoulders, and I am overlocking this edge as well, just to keep it nice and clean. And after overlocking those shoulder seams, I am just gonna overlock that inside edge. That's like the raw edge that I still haven't done anything with, just around the neckline. Because we are going to be attaching the collar to this piece as well, so it's easier to have it nice and neat. And finally, since we're behind the overlocker anyway, I am just doing those two front seams. Now, remember that lining? So we added a collar to the lining. So now we need to attach the other collar piece to the front, or the outside version, the non-lining. So I'm just repeating this process just like we did before, but unlike the other one, we don't have a gap to worry about on this one. So just pinning that in place and sewing it. Remember, remove the pins, don't sew over them, and just take your time, go nice and slow, and it is a curve that you need to worry about. So if there's any puckers, I did have a few, just unpick them, go back, and take your time to sew them again. And like the lining, I could have overlocked all of this afterwards in one go. It would just seem to be the moment that I decided to do it at that point. Anyway, let's continue, and I am clipping this curve on both of the lining and this piece, just to keep the curve actually there once I have put it together. Alright, so this may seem like the scariest part of the whole project, the zipper. Yes, we're putting the zipper in, and that is going to be a little bit on the difficult side, slightly. So I am going to wedge it between the front and the lining. So this is going to make sure that we actually get the zipper hidden. And this, by doing it this way, I actually didn't end up using that final pattern piece that I said in the beginning. I had no idea what to use it for. So yeah, I did struggle a little bit just to get it lined up properly, and that is usually the biggest issue with putting a zipper in. And just a note, I am not putting the zipper all the way at the bottom because we are hemming this still. So that is why I have put it where it is. I am just checking that it's at the right length, and now I'm just gonna pin this in place. So the bottom bit is the most important, and this is what it will look like when it's fully pinned in and sewn in. So I'm just spending a lot of time just making sure it's fully lined up, and I'm pinning this in place, feeling as I go with my thumb especially, just to make sure that it's all in the right place. And just use whatever tool you need to do it. Like I was just using a pin to pull up on the zipper. It's at this point that I'm trying to figure out exactly how long the zipper needs to be, so that I can get it exactly even on both sides later on. But I am leaving it long for now. It is easier to trim it up afterwards, so you don't have to struggle with the zipper moving up and down the whole time. So at this point, I am actually sewing from the bottom up, just worked out better. And this is kind of difficult because you have to just feel a lot and trust your machine. Go really slow and just feel where you need to go. I'm using a lot of my index finger here just to feel where it is. And then my foot is quite wide, so I can just make sure to guide the foot along the edge where the zipper is. And then the needle is just on the side of the foot there. So yes, this is a scary bit. You can also do this by hand first, and then you can do it so you don't have all these pins in the way as well, and you have like a little bit of a line of where you need to sew. But I don't know, if you get it when you're actually doing this, and you can actually feel the zip, so just trust yourself on this. And now when you flip it right side out, you have a really beautiful zip. Now let's repeat that on the other side. The fun. Oh, the fun. So this is a little bit more difficult since you have to actually just look and figure it out. So the easiest way to actually figure out you're doing this in the right place is just detaching the zip. Pin it roughly in place, and then you just need to close it a few times. Just make sure it's in the right spot, and that at least it's not upside down or back to front, or that the teeth are like on the wrong side. So yeah, just pin it in place and then check, double check one more time, and then you can sew. Okay? Check. So well done if you got through that twice. So now it should look like this, with your two zips sticking out, and you've got a beautiful finish on the outside and on the inside. That's what we want. So just take your zip, check that it works, check that everything is lined up properly, and pray to the gods that it does, because, oh, look at that, it did. Okay, well done, we got there. So it is at this point that you can just cut off those two top bits, the extra zipper. As you can see, it is still attached for me, and I'm doing that in like the next little bit. I am actually top stitching in this bit, and I'm not sure if I quite recommend doing it now or a bit later, because it did make it a little bit difficult with turning like on the collar pieces. But hey, that struggle is anyway because it's a zip that's in there. So I don't know, there's not much harm in doing it now. You'll see a little bit later. I do recommend you actually just watch this before you decide to make it, because there's a few things. Anyway, it's just turning it right sides out, and it is here that I'm realizing, oh wait, maybe the top stitching wasn't such a good plan, because I still need to sew the collar shut. So that's what we're doing now. Okay, so this may look a little bit messy and a bit hard, but after sewing that collar, I am just trimming those corner pieces where the zip is. And yes, it's a little bit hard, and this is where I don't recommend having done the top stitching yet, because I think I undid like a little bit. But anyway, this is what your collar should finally look like. And yes, I see now. I only top stitch one side, so it's after you've done the whole collar bit that you want to top stitch both sides, as I'm showing here. Anyway, let's continue. So the next step really is attaching the sleeves. But to do that, I want to make my life, I don't know if it's easier or more difficult, at least more work. I decided to just hand stitch with a basing stitch the two side seams together, just to stop them from moving around, especially at that point when I'm going to be doing the sleeve. So yeah, I don't know if it was definitely worth it though, because I did not struggle with the sleeve as much as I probably would have if I hadn't done this step. It just takes a little bit more effort when you're removing the stitching later on, if you don't want to see it, that is. So let's continue with the sleeve, or more accurately, the sleeve strap thingy. So I am overlocking that top edge again and the sides, just like with the belt loops. And I have folded that in threes, put it under the iron, again, exactly like the belt loops, and top stitching around the sides. So yeah, you could have done this at the same time as the belt loops, as long as you don't forget which is which. Alright, and now that the strap is done, it is time to attach it. So I'm just gonna fold it where it needs to be, and I'm using a piece of chalk to mark it, so I don't have to struggle with like pinning and all of that. Just remember your left and right side mirror it, so if it's on this side, just flip your pattern piece like I'm doing here. And then also when you're attaching the sleeve to the actual coat, again, remember and have a look at which sleeve you're putting in there, and it is actually how you want it to be. So for attaching it, it is just folding over the one edge there, and that is all that we're going to be sewing at this point. So I'm just pinning that the same difficult way. You can just pin it down the side, you know, tuck it under, and top stitching that in place. And back to the coat. So it's time to attach the sleeve, and this is definitely the easiest to do before the side seams are attached. So I'm just folding it in half, using my pin method to find the center so I can line that up with the shoulder seam. And from that point on, you just want to pin down one side first and then the other side. If it is too much of a curve and the pinning isn't going, then you can always just pin one side, sew the one side, stop at the center or the end if you're starting from the center, and then pin the other side. So it really just goes with whatever is the easiest for you to make it work. I can't tell you what's easier. I tend to do it all in one go because that's what I prefer. But just do what works for you, honestly. With both of your sleeves done, it is time to hem the sleeves. So I am just going to do like a really narrow fold over hem. And I'm just going to sew this with a narrow seam. And just remember to keep that strap out of the way and you don't accidentally stitch over it. We're starting to reach the end of construction now, so it is finally time to close up those sides. So I'm using a pin to keep the strap in place on the sleeve where I want it to be. And then I'm just gonna start pinning down the sleeve edge as well as the open sides of the coat. So this is just going to be in one motion that we're going to sew this shut. This is definitely the most exciting bit because the coat comes together. And it's really nice and easy, nothing much to worry about. So yeah, just pinning that and sewing it in place. And just finish when you reach the lining. I continued for no reason, just finish at the lining. And just like everything else, I have overlocked down the sides. And just before turning it right sides out, to relieve some of the tension, I'm just gonna clip into the curve of the coat where the sleeve meets, and then also down this little bit further down the side. And this is absolutely my favorite part of the whole project. We finally get to turn it right sides out. You finally get to see all your hard work put together, nearly finished, almost there, and you get to finally look at it and you can try it on and you get that nice feeling. So yeah, it is a little bit of a struggle with the sleeves, but hey, you can get there. And look at that, it's nearly there. It is so close, so there's a few like strings and threads still around, but it zips and it looks good, and I'm very happy. You should be happy if you're following along. You should be very happy at this point. And now we're finally gonna do that hem. Flip it to the inside, so I'm just roughly showing you right now, that is what it's gonna do. But because of this top stitching that we did, I can't actually get it folded under nicely, so again, I'm back with the issue on the whole top stitching, so I guess it really should have been done at the very end. So if you were following along, I hope you watched until the very end to realize that mistake. But oh well, otherwise it's just a little bit to undo. It's not the end of the world, it's not like we have to undo like the whole thing. But yeah, if you just undo that little bit, if you have sewn it. So what you want to do now is pinch it together and fold it in on itself over the zip so it's back to right sides together. So you can just sew it along that line all the way to the edge where the lining starts. So this is going to allow you, just like a waistband that you would do for like sewing the jeans, a nice finished edge. So I'm just going to trim the corner there so that I've got a nice point to push out. Or at least I will do this after I went off camera because, yeah. Oh look, here I am removing that bulky spot. Yeah, definitely worth it to remove this, otherwise your corner is very bulky. And then I just finished re-sewing the bottom of the top stitching. I guess this would have been the point to actually do the top stitching officially. But hey, it works out anyways. No problems there. But yeah, time for the next step. So what you want to do now is just push the rest of the main coat fabric underneath the lining so that it just lines up exactly where you had sewn just before. So there is just a little bit there that doesn't seem to work out quite as well. And there's a couple ways you can do this. You can ignore it, you can undo a little bit of the lining, you can struggle, cut into the actual coat and work around it. But I'm just gonna ignore it. After a lot of debating, I debated it a lot, went back and forth a few times, and I did try to undo this, as you can see, but I probably recommend just ignoring it, honestly. Don't bother with all of this because, well, there's like the whole overlocking edge and all of that, so ignore it. Please, just stitch it down. I don't know if it's worth it what I ended up doing, but hey, watch and see what I end up doing because it seemed to work out. Still, here's a tip. Ignore it. Back to it. All you want to do is just tuck it underneath and yep, still not working. Still not working. I'm still nowhere. Oh, it seems like I got to a spot where I was happy enough with it. So yeah, just pin it in place, and like I said before, just don't even bother being so complicated as I'm being right now. I also worked away that little edge there that you could see the overlocking from. Again, it doesn't matter if you can cut into it or you can just fold it under if you want to be complicated like me, because life just has to be complicated apparently. And it looks like I finally gave up on that little edge there. I really don't know what I was thinking the whole time. So when sewing this, I'm just gonna line it up with the edge of the foot, honestly. And I'm just making sure that I'm sewing just below the white lining, or maybe even catching the lining since it's underneath. And then I'm just gonna make sure I stay lined up where I am on the machine, keep it nice and straight, and just make sure that I'm actually just catching the hem. And with that done, I'm just gonna go back and do a second stitch line just below it. One, to make sure everything is actually caught when hemming this, and two, to make it look like it's done with like a twin needle, which you could have used for this on, honestly it saves you a bit of time. And it's like got that nice professional looking finish idea, and it brings back all like from the belt loops and all of that because they've got like a double stitch line. And that is the main construction of the coat done. So that's it, you can try it on, you can have everything, that's basically it. But there is one more key feature that is missing, and that is the belt. So that is the really long strip of fabric. So basically, do you remember how we made this belt loops and the arms? Well, that's all that we're going to be doing here as well. So this is going to be folded over into quarters rather than threes this time. So the two sides and then fold it in half as I'm showing on the pattern here for some reason. So yeah, I am also going to be overlocking all around this, so that does give it a bit of bulk, but at the same time it's quite nice, the structure, I have to admit. And here I am using the iron just to get that nice green crisp fold into the belt. So just folding the two sides into the center first, and then I'll go back and fold it in half. To get that clean finish on the belt, I'm just going to move the ends in, just going to fold those. And yes, there is just a little bit of white, but honestly, I'm not even going to worry about that too hard. But as you can see, it does make it quite a bit more bulky. And with that said, I'm just going to sew down both sides just like the belt loops to get that nice little top edge happening. And this is officially the final step, threading the belt through the belt loops.
So, remember this piece? Well, I think, if I'm correct, it is what you're supposed to use to cover the side of the zip, so that if you've got any of those raw edges on the inside, or it will just nicely hide it. So this piece, so it's just a nice little rectangle. So you kind of have to fold it in half. Fold this bit in as well, the seam allowance, just fold that in half. And then once this is all sewn, you just need to fold this around. So you just fold this in, and that way you can just top stitch it down the side here. I am not going to do this. I am happy with how it is. I love how it's turned out. So yeah, we'll just ignore that piece. It's up to you if you want to do it or not. But hey, you've got actual working pockets, you've got a gorgeous belt, and honestly, look at the detailing on this. I love the fact that they've done like the belts. You've got your gap here for the stand that you just need to remember to use and actually leave the gap for. And it's just done. It's done now, and I'm glad.
If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps my channel out. Also, leave a comment down below on ideas you'd like to see next, and I'll see you all the next time. Bye!